And so Season 4 begins with the second part of the Best of Both Worlds. It's episode number 75, and it originally aired on September 24th, 1990. It was written by Michael Piller and directed by Cliff Bull. Now, as you may recall, in the Best of Both Worlds Part 1, the Borg arrived at the Federation, and they kidnapped Picard and turned him into a Borg. Then Picard introduced himself as Locutus and claimed, "From this time forward, you will service us." And at the very last line of the third season's finale, Riker had ordered Worf to fire a new and hopefully lethal weapon at the Borg ship. And as this episode begins, the main navigational deflector discharges, sending intense beam of energy at the Borg ship, and nothing happens. And Locutus informs Riker that the knowledge and experience of Picard are now available to the Borg. And he says, "Your resistance is hopeless, number one." Now the Borg ship warps away and heads toward Earth. Now while the crew repairs the Enterprise from the effects of the massive energy discharge through the deflector, an armada from Starfleet attacks the Borg ship, and the Borg easily defeats them all. And when the Enterprise finally arrives at the battle scene, only charred remains are left of those ships, including the Melbourne, which Riker was offered to captain, as you may recall, in the Best of Both Worlds Part 1. Now, when the carnage is looked at, Riker resolves to destroy the Borg, and he devises a plan to kidnap Picard from the Borg ship. Now he hopes that Picard will retain his knowledge of the Borg and their weaknesses. Riker's plan succeeds, but Dr. Crusher is unable to separate Picard from the Borg collective consciousness, and Data suggests a neural connection between himself and Picard, and perhaps he can access the Borg consciousness. Now when Data makes contact, the Borg ship turns around and races back to the Enterprise, and Data works furiously to find a way to shut it down. Now Picard, who is struggling through the Borg neural modifications, suggests sleep, and Data plants a thought in the Borg collective consciousness, telling them to regenerate. So the Borg ship shuts down, and then, due to the conflicting orders in their collective consciousness, it self-destructs and Picard returns to normal. And that is the conclusion to the two-parter and the end of the first episode of the fourth season. Now, as you may recall from my review of Best of Both Worlds Part 1, Michael Piller was debating whether he was even going to be returning for Season 4 of the show. When he first wrote Part 1 for this, he actually wrote it without knowing what would be the ending with Part 2. So he created this great Part 1 and created a scenario that seemed, even to him, as kind of a hopeless scenario for the Enterprise and the Federation, with Picard being assimilated. So he had no intention of writing Part 2 to get them out of it. He felt like, well, whoever takes over for Season 4 and Part 2, that's their problem to deal with. Turns out Michael Piller did decide to return, so now he's stuck with writing the conclusion, Part 2, and getting himself out of it. And it's kind of interesting. I'll read some of the quotes of what Michael Piller has said about this. He says, as an episode by itself, I don't think Part 2 really has a lot of character stuff. It has to have the battles and all the stuff I don't like writing. The one thing I will say about Part 2, about which I was extremely pleased, was how I figured out to defeat the Borg, because frankly, when I was writing it, I had no idea. I basically discovered the solution at the same time the characters did. It just occurred to me that their strength was their interdependency, so why not make their weakness that same interdependency? And that is pretty clever and kind of interesting that Piller, as he was even writing it, didn't even know what the solution would be until the very end, until they had to come up with that solution. So I think it's clever, and it's really well done, in my opinion. And one thing that I really enjoyed with part 2 here is the scenes between Guinan and Riker, where Guinan is used to having the captain's ear, and that used to be Picard, and now it's Riker. And she makes the big point that Riker needs to let go of Picard. And Riker always counters that he did let go of Picard because he tried to kill him. But the real person that Riker tried to kill was the thing that was aboard the ship, Locutus of Borg, not Picard, because Riker even admits that Picard basically wrote the book on the Federation. He's the most knowledgeable and experienced man ever, and that's what he has to be willing to get rid of. And that's harder for Riker to do. Picard is somebody that Riker has always looked up to, and somebody that Riker was willing to, at least for the moment, give up his own ambition to be captain in order to serve under Picard and be with his family on the Enterprise. So he has to be willing to throw away Picard, and that's what gets him into thinking that perhaps what he needs to do is to kidnap Captain Picard and do something that Picard would not approve of. And that's where Riker comes up with the plan to have this saucer separation, which you would think would be a bad idea because Picard wasn't informed about that plan, but that's what he's counting on. And he uses that as a diversion for Worf and Data to use a shuttlecraft to go in and kidnap Picard and bring him back. And then you see this great showdown, as you can see in the shot right here, of Data and Locutus, and there's actually a moment where Data is linked to Locutus and he senses all of the Borg consciousness and starts reporting, and then Locutus goes into action and Data actually pulls off one of Locutus's arms, and finally he's able to make contact with Captain Picard. And Picard mentions that the thing that the Borg will learn as their weakness is sleep, and he's not talking about necessarily that Picard himself is tired. It's that they need to use that as kind of to trick the Borg and make them regenerate. So I thought that was well done for sure. Now Cliff Bull, who was the director of that episode, feels like this was some of the best stuff that he's done, and he really did get lucky because this was the first two-parter that Star Trek The Next Generation ever did, and it really was a great two-parter. I would say I liked all of the two-parters that were on The Next Generation, but I would definitely say this is probably the best one. Now Elizabeth Dennehy, who I believe is the daughter of Brian Dennehy, who's also a famous actor. She was also in Part 2, and she played Commander Shelby. And she wasn't in it as much in Part 2, but she did share a story where she got really sick of her spacesuit. And that was true of the main cast as well. It was very uncomfortable for them, and it was hard to eat, go to the bathroom, do anything with that. So one rite of passage they told Elizabeth was she had to say, "I hate my spacesuit." And she was more than willing to say that, and they said, "Okay, good, now you're in." So that was pretty funny that she was in that. But Elizabeth Dennehy, I think, did a great job as Commander Shelby in both parts. And I really enjoyed the acting as well. I think Michael Piller does make a good point that in Part 2 it's more action-oriented and you don't have as much character stuff, except for the Guinan Riker scene, which I mentioned. But this was a really good way to sum up, I think, this two-parter. But Part 1 I would definitely say is better. Something that we learn in the Best of Both Worlds that we didn't about the Borg, which kind of changed, as you recall from Season 2, Q-Who, they were simply interested in the technology of the Enterprise. And now you got this new aspect of the Borg where they start assimilating. And Picard is the first one to do that, and later it's not just Picard, but it seems like that's what the Borg, their main thing to do is to assimilate people. So that's this is the start where you first see that, and that's what the Borg do from here on out. So that's a big part of their character. So I really enjoyed this two-parter. Comment below what your thoughts are. Do you feel like part 2 stacked up to part 1? Do you feel like they're equal? Or do you feel like it was a bit of a letdown? I'd love to know your thoughts. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you can be sure to get all the updates as I review each episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Thanks for watching, guys.